Railroad Man, Part 2, Saturday, January 2nd, 1869. On January 2nd, 1869, Cookie and Will were summoned into Superintendent Ferguson's office. "Sit down, gentlemen," the superintendent said. "I have just received a telegram from Thomas Clark Durant, the Vice President and General Manager of the Union Pacific Railroad, and he wants you two men to come and work for him. His railroad is going to connect with the Central Pacific Railroad sometime this year, and once they join, the first transcontinental railroad will be complete. This means that the eastern United States and the western United States will be connected. The Union Pacific is building westward starting in Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific started in Sacramento, California, and is building their railroad tracks eastward." "Yes, I know," Cookie said. "This transcontinental railroad has all the railroad men talking. They say that when this link is completed, it will change what used to take several months to travel by wagon train at a cost of $1,000 or more to several days by railroad at a cost of $70. The prediction from the men is it will change the landscape and population of America. This is history in the making," Cookie concluded. "But why do they want Will and I to come and help?" "Apparently the workers request that you come to cook in one of the several cars set up to feed the men. I guess your reputation of having such good food has spread all the way to California," Superintendent Ferguson answered. "Of course you will only be given to them on loan until the railroads connect. We don't want to lose you two men from our Michigan Central Railroad forever." Though he loved his life as a railroad man, Will wasn't as excited about this western movement of people as the other two men. He knew the effect it would have on the Indians, his native North American brothers and sisters. They would again be displaced from their land like they were during the Trail of Tears back in 1838. His Adudu White Cloud always talked about that terrible time in the history of his Cherokee nation, and how for a long time he felt guilty that he had left years earlier and came to Canada. He felt maybe he should have gone back and fought with his brothers and sisters and perhaps been able to prevent his people from being forced off their land. With the birth of his children and grandchildren, however, he knew the purpose his God had for him. He would educate others about his culture and teach his descendants to continue to do the same. If he was able to pass on that legacy, then the spirit of his beloved Cherokee nation would never die. Will had therefore grown up with the influence of White Cloud and knew he would accept this challenge. He could gain some knowledge during this experience that even at his young age he may be able to help his native sisters and brothers in some small way. Turning in Will's direction, Cookie said, "What do you think, Will? Are you ready to be a part of history?" "I'll go, Cookie, because being with you is a history lesson every day. This is just another day in the life of the cookie car," Will answered, smiling. "That's right," Cookie realized. "I'm glad you mentioned that." Cookie turned back to Superintendent Ferguson. "We'll take the job on the condition I can take my cookie car. I've got everything all set up, and it would make our job a lot easier." "I don't see that as being a problem," Mr. Ferguson said. "You have to take the train to the end of the line where they are still building anyway, so they can just hook up your car. Mr. Durant will like that because the Union Pacific won't have to pay for another railroad car and equip it with everything you'd need." Mr. Ferguson continued, "I'll make all the arrangements. In the meantime, I suggest you go and pack. Looks like you two are following the advice everyone is being given these days. Go west, young man," Mr. Ferguson said as he began laughing. Cookie and Will smiled, thanked Mr. Ferguson, shook his hand, and left. By the next evening, the cookie car was being coupled to the train that would take them to the furthest point of the Union Pacific Railroad line that had been built so far. Within a few days they would be out west where all the construction and activity was going on in the race to reach the Pacific Ocean by rail. This would be the first time Cookie and Will would have traveled so far by train and never had to do any work. They intended to use that time to enjoy all the beautiful country they knew the train would be taking them through. Cookie was also looking forward to getting some time to relax with his corncob pipe while riding along sitting in the open door of his car. Will was hoping to get Cookie talking more about railroading, his family, and the war. During the first day of travel, the two men just sat on the floor in the open doorway watching the countryside go by as the train traveled as fast as it could towards history. On the second evening, as they sat looking at the starlit sky from the moving train, Will looked at Cookie and asked, Why don't you ever use your last name, Cookie? Like I told you before, it's hard enough for people to remember one name. Two names just makes it twice as hard, Cookie answered. What about your family name? That kind of history is more important than the history we're going to witness, Will said. Yeah, Cookie said sarcastically. That's if you have some family history. Will sensed Cookie didn't like to talk about his family, but he also sensed he needed to, so he pressed on. What's your mother like? Will could see a loving calmness wash over Cookie's face. She was a wise and great lady, Cookie said, looking out the door of the train car at the stars in the sky. I remember one time one of the neighbor's boys was coming over to court my older sister Christine, and before he arrived, Ma, Pa, and my sister were waiting in the parlor for him. I, along with my brothers Irvin, Alger, Larry, David, Bradley, Steve, and my younger sister Patty, were all peeking around the corner of the door at our Pa. He was pacing back and forth in front of Ma and Christine. Christine just sat there with her hands folded in her lap and her head bent down looking at them. Our daughter is too young to have some boy coming around here courting her, Pa argued. I know most girls at 14 are married by now, and soon people will be calling her an old maid. But my little baby is special, and I got big plans for her. What has this boy Winston got to give her? What's he want to be anyway? He's 26 years old and he still doesn't have a job. Sounds like a no-account bum to me. We don't know anything about him or his family. My ma, whose name was Evelyn, but we all called her Ma D, sat there quietly like she always did when Pa got this way. When Pa finished, my mother calmly said, I have met his family, and his father is Irish, his mother is Scottish, and he has just finished his schooling and is going to get into education. He wants to be more than just a teacher. He wants to get involved in getting the government to help improve the education system. Pa sniffed. Our mother didn't remind our father that he was 14 years older than she was, and when he came to visit, her father said the same things about him. My father was a good man, and he became one of the most successful businessmen in the county, Cookie said. He continued sitting there smiling, and from the look on his face, Will could see he was reminiscing about other good times he had with his family. After a few minutes, Will interrupted his thoughts. Do you see them very often? Only in my dreams. All of them were killed in the Civil War, and that is why I never talk about that cursed war. Always remember, Will, that in war nobody wins because of all the suffering and death it causes. How can anyone feel they want a war when they have lost their family, their life? Cookie lowered his head as the tears began to well up in his eyes. You could start a family again, Cookie, Will spoke up. Think of it. You would be like Adam from the Bible to your descendants. Only problem is, I don't know if there's an Eve out there who would want someone that could cook better than her. Their laughter was drowned out by the rumbling of the train as it continued westward under the beautiful star-filled sky. For the rest of the trip, Cookie talked more and more about his past and his family. Will learned Cookie's first name was Mortimer and his last name was Douglas, and his family was very close with each other. They were from the southern Appalachian Mountains and one of the more prominent and respected families in their community. The Civil War changed all that. They were all raised to respect their fellow man, but many in his family also strongly believed in the Confederate States' rights to govern themselves, while others believed in keeping the country a union. This caused some of his uncles and cousins, and even one of his brothers, to fight on opposite sides. So this is how Cookie began telling Will how he received the war wound on his arm. It was the end of June, 1863, and we had been marching several days straight, Cookie began, in weather that at times was unbearable. Sometimes it would rain all day and night, then be blistering hot for days at a time. A lot of my fellow soldiers caught the fever and died, while others would just get sick from exhaustion because of all the marching. In the packs on our backs, we had a change of clothes, socks, blanket, and our daily rations. All of us foot soldiers also had our rifle with bayonets flung over our shoulders, and I had my bone-handled bowie knife stuck in my belt. My pa had received 2 of them from Colonel Jim Bowie himself before he was killed at the Alamo in 1836 when they were fighting for the state of Texas. Pa gave the other knife to my very best friend, Eddie Chaplin. My army platoon was ready to defend ourselves in any situations, including the many hand-to-hand fights we had with the enemy. I had been in the Army almost 2 years and fought in 3 major battles and hundreds of smaller skirmishes. Will interrupted Cookie to ask, "Were you afraid during all of this fighting?" Cookie looked at Will intently. "No one has any idea how afraid you become, and how it is such a matter of survival your emotions become numb, and you don't even sense the fear." Cookie continued, "This particular march to battle, however, felt much different than any of the others. The officers were keeping more to themselves, always meeting when we would take the occasional 15-minute rest period. Word began to spread through the ranks that we were heading to a place in the state of Pennsylvania. In the afternoon of June 30th, we finally set up camp in the hills on the south side of a little town most of us had never heard of before, called Gettysburg. The place was beautiful, and the singing of the birds and crickets was a welcome sound to the men instead of the constant noise of an army on the move." "You guys must have been happy for the rest and relaxation," Will said. "We were," Cookie said. "Only problem is it didn't last long, because throughout the night the opposing armies arrived, and by morning everyone could sense the impending battle would begin at any time, especially when the birds and crickets stopped their singing." Suddenly, on the far side of the town, a large explosion followed by a series of others erupted. Sounds of men shouting, then the rapid fire of many guns could be heard by everyone in our unit. We all immediately got our weapons and prepared for battle. And what a battle it was! We fought all that day and the next, back and forth, with neither side gaining an advantage. On the battlefield there were many dead and injured, crying for their parents, or just laying there praying for death to escape the pain they were in. Will sat there, hanging on to every word of Cookie's story as he continued with his incredible tale. "Our sergeant, Brandon Thompson, had us stay in pairs to protect each other's back. Charlie Farmer was my partner, and we soldiered on in battle side by side. Late that afternoon on the second day there was a lull in the fighting, even though you could hear the occasional cannon fire and gunshot followed by men screaming. Sergeant Brandon approached us looking for a few good men to raid one of the enemy's positions. Charlie Farmer and I immediately volunteered along with 6 other members of our platoon. The sergeant beckoned for us to follow him to a tent full of other officers. Using a map of the surrounding area, the officer in charge, Captain Ken Donald, briefed us on where our point of attack would take place, but he wouldn't divulge the intended target because he didn't want to jeopardize this operation. Despite the objections of his fellow officers, he said he would lead our group because he couldn't let his men face a danger that he would not face himself. Sergeant Brandon insisted he also be allowed to go because he had been on these types of missions before and therefore was the most experienced. So there we were, 10 men, putting their lives on the line with the hope of ending this horrific battle. "Wow!" Will exclaimed. "You guys were very brave." Cookie continued. "The sergeant suggested we leave our backpacks and anything else that may hinder our speed of travel and ability to move among the brush and woods. He said our guns would be all we needed. He emphasized that surprising the enemy was the key to the success of this mission. When the sun went down, we left camp and headed towards the enemy position on the opposite side of town. We traveled quickly and quietly. Captain Donald led us to a small mud hole where he instructed us to take off our shirts and to smear mud over our faces and bodies. This would allow us to blend in with the foliage so we could get closer to the enemy before they would discover us. Once everyone was ready, we separated into 2 groups of 5 and then we moved into position. We circled in opposite directions until we had our intended target between us. Charlie and I finally saw who we were going to attack. A group of 30 to 40 enemy officers were camped in the clearing just below where we were hiding. The order to move in would not take place until just before dawn, when the captain felt the officers would be least expecting attack. In the dark, he knew they would be confused where the attack was coming from and how many of us there were. Sergeant Brandon and his group were on the opposite side of the clearing, and the signal to attack would be initiated when our group swarmed the officers. At precisely 4 o'clock in the morning, we began our assault. "What happened next?" Will impatiently asked. "Once the first shot was fired, all hell broke loose," Cookie said. "Men stumbled out of their tents, some with their pants at their knees trying to pull them up and at the same time attempting to get their rifles into firing position. For many of the officers it was too late. We had rushed in, shooting and hacking at people with the bayonets fixed at the end of our rifles. Unfortunately, one of our enemy came up behind my partner, Charlie Farmer, and cut his throat before any of us had a chance to react. I flung myself at the fellow, and he and I engaged in a life-and-death struggle. The rest of our raiding party was consumed by their own fighting, so it became a series of hand-to-hand conflicts throughout the camp. Captain Donald was fighting with a couple officers at one time and was giving them both all they could handle. I never had time to assess what was going on with him and my companions because the fellow in front of me had only one thing in mind, and that was to make me pay for this raid just like he made my partner, Charlie, pay with his life. The man also had a bowie knife, and he was able to cut my arm from the shoulder to the wrist. Blood began spurting out of my arm like a waterspout, but the anger over the death of my fellow soldier and the instinct to survive caused me to go crazy. I began slashing and cutting with my knife in blinded fury. When I finally stopped, my enemy lay in front of me, soaked in blood. "Were the others in your party okay?" Will asked, beginning to see why Cookie never liked to talk about the war. Although it was difficult for Cookie, he knew he had to finish his story. An eerie silence fell over the camp. The fighting was over. I took the bandana from around my neck to wipe the blood off the man that I had just killed. I wanted to see my enemy. When I cleaned the blood from his face, I gasped and fell to my knees. Before me, lying in a pool of his own blood, was my best friend, Eddie Chaplin, the bone-handled bowie knife my father had given him lying by his open hand. In the heat of the fighting, and with all of the mud on my face and Eddie's new beard, we had not recognized each other. It was at that moment I became disillusioned with the war and swore that after it was over I would only become part of building America and not destroying her. That's why I became a railroad man. Cookie wanted to finish, so he talked on. My eyes finally focused on the carnage that was now the scene around me. I crawled over to where Captain Ken Donald now lay between the two dead officers that he had been fighting. He was severely injured, but was still conscious. I grabbed his hand to try and assure him he would be okay and we would get him back to camp for some medical help. He held on tightly, and you could see he realized he would not make it. "Tell my wife Patricia that I love her," is all he kept repeating as we held hands until he died, Cookie sadly said. Even though our raid was successful, only 4 of us survived, including Sergeant Brandon. There weren't any survivors in the enemy camp. One of the armies eventually won this Battle of Gettysburg, but the statistics from the 3 days of fighting from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, proved we were all losers. The Union Army had 26,210 casualties, 14,531 wounded, and 5,369 captured or missing. The Confederate Army had 27,939 casualties, 12,693 wounded, and 5,830 captured or missing. The war waged on for 2 more years, but because of my injuries, I was given a new assignment to work on the railroad and help by getting troops and supplies to the front lines. So you see why I don't talk about the war. And contrary to what you may think, there is nothing glamorous or adventurous about being a soldier. Protection of one's family and property is one thing, but to go to war for any other reason is not good enough for me. When Cookie had finished, he was exhausted. Reliving the war was not a pleasant memory for him. Like the time his father, Uncle Jim, Dr. Clare, and John Freeman Walls told him stories about the Underground Railroad, Will was again amazed by the sacrifices people made to make a better life for their children and descendants. He had a restless sleep that night, dreaming at times of Cookie's experiences and at other times of his family back home. He realized how much he loved his family and how important it was that they all stay close with one another. He knew when he got back to Detroit there was one thing he must do: visit his family in the Elmstead Pugh settlement. The remainder of the trip, Cookie talked about railroading, and Will learned more than he ever had in the past and would in the future. This also allowed them both to get their mind off of Cookie's war stories. He told Will to consider himself a true railroad man, he should know some railroad history and the different responsibilities of the railroad men. Cookie said that Colonel John Stevens is considered to be the father of American railroads. In 1815, he was granted the first railroad charter in North America, and in 1826, he demonstrated the feasibility of steam locomotion on a circular track in Hoboken, New Jersey. Cookie described every major railroading job he had ever held, other than when he was a cook's helper, because he knew Will already had experience doing that job. When he was the brakeman, his responsibilities including inspecting the train, operating the brakes, assisting switching the tracks, and helping the conductor. As telegrapher, he sent out and received messages over wire via coded signals. He was a baggage clerk for a while, tagging, loading, and unloading passenger luggage. The fireman job was dangerous because he had to feed the firebox with fuel, and there was always the chance it could explode in your face. The one job he did for the shortest length of time because he didn't like it was as a special station agent, which was the railroad police. He had to arrest anyone that tried to get a free ride on the train, and there were plenty of people after the war that could not afford to pay for a ride, but needed to take a train somewhere to get a job. He felt sorry for them and understood their dilemma. He didn't want to add to their troubles by taking them to jail, so he quit. The railroad job with the most responsibility for the safety of the train and its passengers, besides the engineer, was the conductor, who was in charge of the train and its crew. Cookie said he enjoyed that job, but he would have to travel more, and he liked his Detroit, Dearborn, and Ypsilanti run. He said he was asked to be an engineer and operate the train, but his arm began acting up, and so he decided he would go back to his first love, which was preparing food for the passengers and his fellow railroad men. Their conversation and watching the country go by made the journey seem to end before it started. When the train pulled up to the furthest point west that the Union Pacific had laid railroad track, Will and Cookie stood in the doorway, amazed at all the men and the activity. The bosses in charge of the work crew were shouting orders to their men in different languages. You could hear the ringing of spikes as workers hit them with their sledgehammers, driving them into the ground to secure the rails in place. Will and Cookie simultaneously commented on all the different nationalities of people there. The majority were Irish veterans of both the Confederate and Union armies, but there were many others, including Chinese, newly freed slaves, German immigrants, Indians from different tribes, Mormons, Protestants, Catholics, atheists, and people from every religious group in America, a melting pot of the population who were all working with the common goal to unite the United States by railroad. Will looked around at all the workers, and it seemed every railroad man in America was there. The engineer hauling the cookie car was instructed to back it up into one of the spots alongside the other cars that were there for preparing food. Many of the ethnic groups preferred their own food and cooks. For example, the German immigrants were more comfortable having a German cook preparing their food. The Chinese insisted on bringing their own cooks who were familiar with their eating habits, and so the cookie car was there to help feed the men who didn't care what they ate, as long as it was food. Once word spread through the camp that the cookie car had arrived, and because of its reputation among the railroad men of having such good food, many Germans, Chinese, and others would wait in the long lines at the cookie car. The lines became even longer when Cookie quickly learned to cook the food they liked and put in his secret ingredients that he became famous for. He provided venison, rabbit, squirrel, quail, pheasant, and pigeon on his menu, along with lots of vegetables. Sometimes when he could get it, he would make fish for the men. One meat Cookie refused to prepare was buffalo, because Will had told him the importance of this animal to the Indians that lived on the plains. When Will had learned that the passengers and even some workers would shoot these animals for sport, he was appalled. He had learned from the Indians that even though there were great numbers of these beasts, at the rate they were being slaughtered, they could become extinct. If that happened, it would affect the very existence of the Indians that lived out west. They depended on the buffalo for everything from their food and clothing to their homes, and would only hunt enough to fulfill these needs. This small act to not cook buffalo meat by Cookie out of respect for Will's wishes made Will know his friend really cared. He felt that together, in some small way, they slowed down the endangerment of the buffalo, even if it was one buffalo at a time. The time drew closer when the Union Pacific Railway and the Central Pacific Railway would unite, and the newspapers around the country put out daily reports of each day's progress. It became obvious that the meeting would likely occur in Promontory, Utah, which was in a level circular valley about 3 miles in diameter and surrounded by mountains. There became a race between the competing railroads to try and lay more miles of rail than the other. Charles Crocker, the construction boss of the Central Pacific, boasted that his Chinese workers could lay 10 miles of rail in one day and would bet anyone $10,000 this could be achieved. When Thomas C. Durant, vice president of the Union Pacific, heard of this boast, unfortunately for him, he took the bet. He lost, because on April 28, 1869, the Central Pacific workers laid 10 miles of track in just 12 hours, an amazing feat that has never been equaled. The two railroads were scheduled to unite on May 8, 1869, but because the officials from the Union Pacific were not going to arrive on time, the ceremony was rescheduled for May 10th. Governor Leland Stanford of California arrived that morning, and by noon the two trains were close enough that the last railroad tie could be laid. The last tie had a silver plate in the middle with the date and names of the officials of both railroad companies. Cookie, Will, and the rest of the railroad men were excited while they waited in anticipation for the historical moment when the two railroads would unite. The ceremony was wired by telegraph around the country, and people all over were waiting for the final 4 spikes, 2 gold and 2 silver, to be driven. Governor Stanford was on the north side of the track representing the Central Pacific Railroad, and Thomas C. Durant of the Union Pacific Railroad was on the south side of the track, ready to hammer in the final 2 gold spikes. The spikes were driven in at 12:45 p.m. on May 10, 1869, in Promontory, Utah. The engines of the two railroads touched each other, and this moment was celebrated by pouring champagne on the last rail as the workers erupted in cheers and threw their hats in the air. Will and Cookie hugged, then shook hands and slapped the backs of the other men around them. Across the country, the event was signaled by bells ringing in New Orleans, Washington, Boston, New York, and Omaha. Chicago put on a huge parade, and other major cities had various celebrations, including 100-gun salutes. Cookie looked at Will and asked, "Well, Mr. William Perry from the Elmstead Pew Settlement just outside Windsor, Ontario, Canada, what do you think?" "Unbelievable," is all Will could say. The next few days saw the railroad camp become slowly abandoned as a lot of the workers went back to their regular railroad jobs. Cookie and Will began packing up the cookie car for their journey back to Detroit. The next few months were anticlimactic for Will. He still enjoyed his trips to Ypsilanti to visit Joseph and his new wife Stella, but nothing in railroading quite reached the same intensity as that day in May when the Transcontinental Railroad became a reality. One morning, early in 1870, they were preparing the cookie car for another trip when one of the messenger boys from the Brush Street Railroad Station ran up to the car. "Hello, is Mr. William Perry here?" "I'm William Perry. What can I do for you?" Will wondered. "Superintendent Ferguson wants you to come to his office immediately. He says he has an urgent message for you," the boy said. Will gave Cookie a puzzled look and then jumped out of the car to follow the young messenger to the superintendent's office. When he reached the door, Mr. Ferguson opened it before Will had a chance to knock. Come in, William, and sit down. I just received this telegram that I will read." "Uncle Jim is ill. Stop. Come home quickly. Stop. We will pick you up in Windsor this afternoon. Stop. Love, your mother and father." Will immediately left the office and went back to the cookie car. He told Cookie the news, then grabbed his belongings and headed to Captain Sloan's ferry service. Captain Sloan made a special stop at the Windsor dock to let Will off after he explained the emergency. He instructed his crew and the other passengers that they would be going to Amherstburg and Toledo as usual once Will went ashore. Henry Perry and Will's brother, young Jim, were waiting in their wagon as Will came running towards them. "How's Uncle Jim?" he asked. "He's hanging in there," his father, Henry, said, "but I don't know for how much longer. Your Aunt Lynetta and your sister Margaret have been by his side around the clock taking care of all his needs. He's asked about you several times, Will. You're the last of his nieces and nephews that he hasn't seen since his illness. Your brother Joseph and his wife Stella had come from Ypsi for a visit when Uncle Jim became sick, so they decided to stay until he was back on his feet." Will shook hands with his brother, young Jim, and climbed into the back of the wagon. The three men headed out of town, with young Jim keeping the horses moving at a faster pace than usual. Once they arrived at Uncle Jim and Aunt Lannetta's farm, Will was so anxious to see his uncle that he jumped out of the wagon before it came to a complete stop. He ran up to the porch, ignoring the other family members gathered outside, then gently knocked on the door as he walked in. Will heard muffled crying in the corner where his mother Kazar and Aunt Lannetta were being comforted by the pastor from the church. His sister Margaret was sitting next to the bed where Uncle Jim was laying, and she was gently wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. When Will approached, Margaret stood up and without saying anything hugged her brother and then joined her mother and the others. Will took her place in the chair beside the bed and leaned down closer to his uncle. He looked up at Will with watery eyes and winked. In a voice barely above a whisper, Uncle Jim weakly smiled and asked, "So how's my favorite railroad man doing?" "I'm fine, Uncle Jim. So how's my favorite and only uncle doing?" Will asked, trying to act happy. "Okay, if I can just get rid of this darn old fever, I should be on my feet in a couple days," Uncle Jim responded as he continued smiling, trying to make Will feel comfortable. "I have to get back out in those fields to help your pa, Doo, and brother young Jim with harvesting the crops." "Don't worry about the farm, Uncle. I'm home now, and we'll make sure everything is taken care of. You just rest and get yourself better." Will did not want to remind his uncle that it was not the time of year to harvest crops, so to stop him from worrying, he said, "Why don't I tell you some of my railroad stories? Since the last time I was here to visit, I went to Promontory, Utah, and witnessed the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad connecting, creating the first transcontinental crossing of the United States." "Yes, that would be a good story to hear, Will," his uncle said. "I had read the letter you sent to your parents telling them about this exciting event." So Will began telling his uncle about his railroad adventures, including the driving of the Golden Spike. By the time he had finished, his uncle had drifted off into a peaceful sleep. Will quietly stood up and then went over to hug his Aunt Lannetta and Mother Kazar. Blinking back his tears, he left the room and stepped back out onto the porch and into the sunny winter weather. The family was all there, and even though everyone was in a somber mood, they did not let it become depressing because their uncle would not want it to be that way. Uncle Jim died that evening, but Aunt Lannetta said the last thing her loving husband requested is that everyone remembers the good times they had together and to celebrate his life, not mourn his death. He also wanted to make sure people would get plenty to eat at his funeral, which he referred to as his homegoing. Will went home early, but before going in the cabin, he climbed up on his favorite branch in the old oak tree in their front yard. He sat in the tree for the next hour thinking about all the wonderful times he had spent with his uncle. When he felt better, he climbed down and went into the house to comfort his mother and father. A couple of days after the funeral, while having dinner at his parents' home, Will broke the news. "I'm not going back to railroading. Instead, I'm going to come home and help work on the farms. I will return to the Michigan Central Railroad just long enough to give Superintendent Ferguson notice of me leaving. I should be home in time for the spring planting." "You're not going back to railroading?" his father exclaimed. "But you love being a railroad man." "I know," Will said, "but I love my family more, and Aunt Lannetta, you, Doo, White Cloud, and young Jim need me now. Besides, I had promised I would come back to the farm, and so here I am. With Brother Joseph now having a life with Stella and Ypsilanti, it only makes sense that I be here." His father could not argue with that logic, so all he could do was nod his head in agreement. Will's young sisters, 9-year-old Parthena and 7-year-old Sarah, were glad their brother was coming back to stay because they had really missed him. "Hooray! Our brother is coming home!" they clapped in unison. The following weeks were hectic, as Henry, along with his 2 sons, young Jim and Will, put the affairs of their uncle's farm in order. They helped Aunt Lannetta in any way they could and kept her as busy as possible to keep her from thinking about the recent loss of her husband. The transition went smoothly, and before long things around the Perry farms began to return to normal. Farming wasn't what Will had intended to do his whole life, even though he respected the farmer. He knew that it was one of the most honorable occupations a person could have, and the farm was important in contributing to the resources of a community. Right now, his priority was to keep his promise and help his family until he wasn't needed anymore, but he knew one day he would leave again to follow his dreams and fulfill his destiny. Will returned to the Brush Street Railroad Station and told Superintendent Ferguson his intentions of returning to the farm. He explained he was not needed back home until spring planting, so he asked if he could continue working with Cookie to give him some time to find someone to replace him. The superintendent was in agreement, so Will headed out to the Cookie car and back to work. When Cookie saw his old friend, he ran up and gave him a big bear hug and swung him around in a circle. "Welcome back, my friend. I've really been missing you. Isn't the same around here without you?" Will returned the hug. "I was busy back home helping with the affairs and making sure my Aunt Lynetta was comfortable. But I'm back now and ready to go to work." Will didn't want to ruin this reunion celebration, so he didn't tell his friend that he was only back for a while. He waited until the next day before he broke the news to Cookie, and even though he wasn't happy to see Will go, he understood.